everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar with Binary Stream today. A huge thank you to Justin and Jerry for being here and presenting today. So with that being said, I will hand things off to you, Justin.
Well, thanks, Ali. Thanks, everyone. Obviously, thank you for being here today. Again, as Ali mentioned, my name is Justin McCool. I'm one of the partner success managers at Binary Stream. Our role here is really just working with our partners and customers and really managing that relationship, supporting the sales cycle in doing that. And really that encompasses for us many of the kind of pre-sales activities such as webinars, et cetera, and then supporting any interest in the sales cycle from a Binary Stream standpoint, supporting that. And then with me, I've got Jerry Taylor, who's one of our solution consultants. And Jerry, do you want to just say a couple quick words?
Sure. Thanks, Justin. Well, good morning, everybody. It's nice to meet you all. My name is Jerry Taylor. As Justin mentioned, I'm a solution consultant here at Binary Stream. I work on the sales team in sort of a pre-sales capacity when determining requirements for how to for customers to improve their processes when they're looking at multi-entity management and trying to determine how that fit is for their business processes and how we can support going forward. And I typically do the demonstrations so you can get a really good visual on how it works and how that will support you.
That's great. Thanks, Jerry. That's awesome. So yeah, hey, obviously from today's calls perspective, we're going to be talking about multi-entity management, as Jerry mentioned. And we've got a series of products for our Dynamics 365 Business Central, portfolio. Really, who are Binary Stream, right? I mean, we're pretty, I'd say, well known in the circle of Microsoft and of the ISVs out there. One of the largest. We've been a member of Vendors, really closely aligned with Microsoft. And I like to bring this slide up as really just an introduction of who we are, frankly, and how closely we're tied. One, to our partner channel. The TM Group has been a preferred partner of Binary Stream for a very long time. We work very closely on supporting their customers and their efforts around our products and just everything we can do to help support some of those solutions or those gaps that we can fill with respect to Business Central. But really, the bottom line is we're pretty represented out there right across the globe with over 2,000 customers. We have over 300 partners. We're very closely aligned with Microsoft, along with our partners. I mean, for us, the channel is everything. And really, as being a gold partner of Microsoft, being an inner circle member for quite some time, that we really just are lockstep in what they're doing. So if you are managing or using a Microsoft ERP, usually we have a series of products or a product that can solve for maybe potentially a gap that you're facing. That's a little bit more about Binary Stream. Yeah, let me move on to the next slide here. What are we doing? So really, at the end of the day, we've got three kind of primary solutions that we manage and help support our D365 Business Central, customers on. One is our subscription billing suite, which is really for that recurring side of things. The next is multi-entity management. We've got over 20 years at least experience in multi-entity management. It's what Binary Stream was ultimately built upon. We had that product for close to 20 years. We still do within GP. And many years ago, really the same requirements existed with Business Central. Many of our partners, Microsoft, came to us and said, hey, it would really be great if you could extend that functionality across the Business Central product so that we could take advantage of the same, solution that we had in GP. Well, that's what we're going to be focusing on today. But we also have a portfolio around these. Lease management, really managing ASC 842, both on the revenue expense side. If you have kind of areas of those, gaps or concern within those three areas of your Business Central, then, talk to TM Group, talk to your resources there, and they'll align us to maybe potentially help you with some of that. With respect to today's call, like I mentioned, we're going to be focused on multi-entity management. When you think of multi-entity management, I've got a few more slides here. Really, these are the big four things that we try to accomplish, or what, if you asked our companies what we're helping them with. So really taking, the existing environment in a multi-entity, multi-company situation, and really consolidating that down into one company as best we can. And in doing that, really, we know that with separate companies, there can be a lot of intercompany transactions, a lot of processing between those companies back and forth. Really typically takes a significant amount of time and effort and whatnot. Multi-entities really designed to help alleviate much of that process, really automate it, make it a heck of a lot easier for when people are trying to create those transactions with allocations, et cetera, across the companies that we help with that. Really master records across are a huge other aspect of what we're doing. So instead of maintaining customer vendors, et cetera, we're across different companies within the solution. We really consolidate. You just have one master set that you can share across. So you can imagine, with companies that are, 3 to 5, we have customers out there with hundreds of entities. And you can imagine how much easier that makes life for them in the ERP. And then security roles, reporting, things like that are what we're helping with multi-entity. So I'm more of a visual representation. Really, when you think of this next slide, have a look at what you're seeing on the left there. And if you think of Business Central, really for lack of, getting into any specifics, that's what you're looking at. So each of the companies that you see with those dotted lines are sitting independently they really don't talk necessarily back and forth to each other as efficiently as they could. There's, and every kind of balancing transaction across companies really has to be manually driven. And you're maintaining, again, as a separate set of master records across those companies as well. And then again, obviously from a consolidated reporting standpoint, you're really not seeing a lot of efficiency there too, because although you can create a consolidated company and consolidate those reports, it really isn't as seamless as what we bring to the table with respect to multi-entity or management. On the right-hand side, you can imagine that is what we bring to the table. So instead of those separate individual silos or companies, as you can see on the right, you can see it's one consolidated dot. We're bringing all that together. We're really taking the ability to create reports, create those balancing transactions, allocations, et cetera, into the fold and really making that more efficient. So there are some limitations with respect to how we consolidate those companies in Business Central, of which obviously fiscal year end is a huge one for us. It has to be aligned in the same fiscal year end. We basically GL kind of accounts have to be the same relatively within the the ERP, which they are for the most part in Business Central anyway. And then functional currency has to be the same. We do have customers though that's not possible for whatever reason. They might have functional currencies across the globe. So they might have 15 US-based companies and 3 Canadian-based companies and 2 more Mexican-based companies. And we bring to the table a product called Intercompany Suite, which allows you to really take all of the silos. In that example, you would have 15 consolidated US-based companies, call it 5 Canadian-based companies and two Mexican-based companies. But we would still be able to create that function across those companies using kind of an add-on to MEM, which is called intercompany. So we've got that area covered as well. Really, if you do and are dealing with a situation where you're working with multiple companies, MEM Intercompany Suite should be able to help you. So if you think of MEM on the call and you think of what we like to think of our ideal customer profile, ICP as we call it internally, this is kind of what you're looking at. For us, MEM is as flat as it gets. I mean, there's definitely some industries with PLM, our lease management and our subscription billing that really align well to the product. As you can imagine with multi-entity managers, it's as flat as it comes. With that, it really allows most organizations that just manage a lot of companies to succeed in doing that with MEM. So really the kind of the business focus of those areas are if you're struggling with intercompany transactions, consolidations, FP&A, then obviously MEM would be a good fit. Really, again, it's available in GP and ERP, horizontal, vertical. We do a lot of healthcare, long-term care, franchising are specialties for us, I guess, if you need to kind of put out there. And really the ICP characteristics are kind of there for you as we leave. 3 or more subsidiaries, if you're managing multiple databases, and really just want to share most of that information across the organization. I'll leave this with you as a touch point in future. The next slide here, as you can see, is really kind of the common pain points we see. Consolidated reporting, right? It takes us a lot of time to consolidate financials between multiple databases. Cumbersome intercompany transactions. So that struggle, like we talked about, can be pretty apparent for most people that are dealing with multiple companies in their ERP. Duplicating records, usually an issue when you're maintaining things across and separately within it. Managing security, obviously when it comes to consolidating companies and making sure that there's one environment that everyone's working in, do they have the right access? Do we want to limit access to the companies to the areas that we don't want them to be seeing or working within, et cetera? Yes, that is obviously a component of MEM and what we're doing. With respect to localizations, MEM is for us a very global product, just like BC. We're really trying to align at a minimum with localizations across what Business Central is doing. But we've got some pretty large enterprise companies, probably ones that you would be surprised that are actually on Business Central, but amazing because there's a lot of factors that contribute to that. But as you can see on the screen here, this is where our localizations exist today. We're still building those out. That's happening with our development team on a monthly basis. But this gives you an idea. I mean, for the most part, obviously North America, well covered, just like Europe. We're starting to build out Asia Pacific and Latin America, and we're still going to build from there. There's some stuff happening in other areas in Asia as well. And that'll be something that'll continue to happen. Integrations are a huge part of MEM. When it comes to other ISVs, ISV stands for independent software vendor, which is what we are. But here's many of the others. And because just of the nature of MEM, most out there have created some type of integration. Some don't need it at all just because of the way the product works. but we work, constantly on creating integrations with our partners out there. That obviously involves channel partners, but just as big for us as ISV partners. Here's just a few that I put on the screen here that, areas of situations where we create the integration, the support of those products for things like, automated payroll, or not payroll, AP automation, check writing. There's many out there that you can see. Reporting, obviously, from a solver perspective. I'll just leave that with you as just an example of what we're doing. And then when you think about development, guys, here are a few things. We are constantly working with MEM, obviously making it better. I won't spend too much time on this screen either. What I want you to take away from it is that we are consistently and constantly working with our partners, with Microsoft, with our customers, most importantly, to always enhance the product. We've got a clear roadmap set for 2023. We had a roadmap set for 2022. This is a product that's obviously evolving with the introduction of some new features from BC. And then obviously we've got to make sure we complement that with respect to what we're doing in MEM. But here's a few examples of what we're doing this year. And obviously there's more behind the scenes, but if I obviously want to populate a slide with some of the examples of this, but really just understand that this is an ever-changing, ever-improving product that you're going to see with a clear roadmap identified. So here's 2022. You can see intercompany bridge was created last year, advanced warehouse assemblies. There's a ton of stuff happening. So where do you go if you need extra questions? I know I said a lot, but I really want to hand things over to that she can kind of give you a closer look at the product, because I always proof is, and I'll hand things over in a minute. Here's some contact points. There's a ton of information out there. Obviously, being part of Microsoft and the Business Central ecosystem, everything we do is on AppSource. Great resource there. Our website, the portal, and just feel free to contact me anytime if there's any additional questions after the call. Without further ado, let's have a look, and I'll hand things over to Jerry, and she can take it over from here. So thanks, everyone.
That's great. Thanks, Justin. Okay, before we get started, I'll just give a little bit of an outline of what I intend to cover today. And if there are any questions, like Justin mentioned, go ahead and put them in the chat box, and he'll take a look at them as we're going through the presentation. And we'll also have a few minutes at the end of the call to get into a little bit more detail if needed. For today, we're going to cover, what does it look like when MEM is installed into Business Central? What kind of visibility are you going to be able to achieve into your operations and efficiencies that you can gain when you centralize operations inside of a single Business Central company? We'll take a look at how do we set those companies up? How do we manage that data and maintain that separate set of financial records, all the while having the security that there's enabling control and perhaps restricting access on a role-by-role basis, and therefore protecting access to sensitive data. What does it look like when we process transactions that have an intercompany impact, and how do we automate that intercompany transaction to really be able to give you that full audit trail code and ability to reconcile any companies involved in a transaction on a real-time, everything is always in sync. And then what does it look like when you want to be able to pull that data, when you want to do inquiries or to be able to report on that data, either on an entity by entity basis, or when you want to generate a consolidated sort of centralized view and get the overview of your full company performance. That's going to be the agenda for what we'll cover. I'm getting started now. When we have the MEM extension installed into Business Central, everything is going to look the same, and all of your transactions and Business Central processes are going to be exactly the same. But now we're just adding in that layer of MEM to give you the ability to manage multiple companies in a more streamlined manner and to be able to engage in those intercompany transactions in a much more efficient manner. So getting started, we've got MEM. Now, instead of having to log in and log out of various companies or toggle between companies, everything's going to be inside of this single Business Central company. Instead of having to switch companies from your available companies, I've now got what's called, I'll call it, instead of Cronus, I'm calling it the Cronus group of companies. How do we do that? Well, we're actually utilizing Business Central functionality right out of the gate with how we maintain the companies. And we do that using the dimensions. Dimensions being that really fantastic aspect of Business Central for giving you additional data, being able to analyze and track data separately for additional reporting capabilities. We're also using that to identify the companies. We're using one of the two global dimensions to identify the companies and to be able to keep all data separate and track at a transactional level for our financial reporting and such. So in here, I've got a dimension already set up called company. And when you come into the dimension values, these values you see here now represent all my companies. I've got 10 companies set up in this single Business Central instance. I've got it set up. I'm using numerical codes, but that's fine. You don't have to do that. You can use alpha to whatever characters you get. I believe it's 20 characters to set up your company code ID. But these values, as I mentioned, are now what represent your individual legal entities. What's really powerful about this is as you're growing and maybe taking on new acquisitions or starting new legal entities, the ability to add a new entity is always a bit of a challenge in terms of what our customers have relayed back to us. It takes a little bit of effort to create that company, go through the new configurations, set up the new master records, the new chart of accounts. But when you're using MEM, all you need to do is add a new code here. And for all intent and purpose, you could really start entering transactions just like that. There's some additional security you can affect, but to get started, to create that new entity, all you need to do is add that code. Now from here, we've got an entity setup window because you want to be able to add your unique company information where you might have your federal ID number, you might have a logo that you want to have on different reports, maybe it's on the sales invoices or on the purchase orders, and you can add that for each dimension value. There's going to be an entity setup page. You add your billing information. You might want to default things such as the bank account, and that's just by default. It doesn't have to be added here. But if you think about you have a particular bank account that you use on all transactions, you can default that here just to make that process much more efficient whenever transactions that affect a bank account are going to come into play, such as payments or cash receipts. You can also have some additional configurations such as number series. Maybe each company is going to have its own unique sales invoice numbers so that they're sequential from entity to entity versus having one shared number. You can set up different numbers for sales, for purchasing, for manufacturing, and so on and so forth. That's how simple it is just to get started to create those entities and manage them all in that side of one Business Central instance. Now from there, we do have a little bit of configuration can be done, and we're not going to go through all of this today. We're just going to talk about the security aspect, because when you're managing all the data inside of one Business Central company, a big concern can be, how do I maintain that access and restrict access to protect any sensitive data where not all users are perhaps able to work within all entities, nor do they need to or should they be able to see any of the financial reporting. Here's where our user security that comes into play. For each Business Central user and login, you're going to be able to determine which legal entities they have access to. Here's those listed dimension values we just saw, the 10 companies, and my user login only has access to these entities that are highlighted here. Now we've made it really easy for any of the setup and configuration windows to be able to import that data using a config package or an API or just an Excel upload. But the point here is that as a user, I'm only going to be able to enter a transaction for or a report on entities that I've been checked here. When I go in and we see looking at the transactions, this list is going to be filtered for me. And as a user, I won't have any indication that there's any other entities in this environment other than the ones that I can see here. That's where it gets very specific on a user by user basis, so you can ensure that that security is in play. The next portion of security is master records. Now, when we install MEM into Business Central, you'll now have one chart of accounts and one set of master records, which is really great in terms of eliminating redundancies. If we think at the vendor level, when you set up separate companies, you have to have a chart of account in each company, you have to have separate customers or vendor records, and oftentimes we find that those lists are repetitive across the different legal entities where they might have the same vendor that is used in all those different legal entities. And instead of having to set those up one by one, you now have one master list to manage. That means you don't have to change an address or a phone number or a sales rep in all of those different records. You get to change it once. But we have the ability to add security to that in case those records should not be shared across all the legal entities. They can be, and you don't have to do any additional setup, but as an option, you can put restrictions in place. If we use that example of vendors, and we say, this is my full vendor master record list, but not all legal entities can transact with all vendors. In the case of what I call my head office, company 000, they have access to all the vendors. But where if I switch to entity 400, you can see this has now become a restricted list. So as a user, when they go in to enter a transaction in entity 400, they're going to see this filtered list. There's not going to be any risk of posting a transaction to a vendor that should not interact with this specific entity. Once again, for initial setup, we have the ability to import this and make that a really simple process. That covers how to set up the legal entities, what to do, and how easy it is to set it up if you expand or get a new acquisition, and what does the security look like to make sure that users are only going to see data for entities that they have access to, and how do we ensure that our master records are congruent with the companies or entities that they should be doing business with. For next steps, we'll go into what does it look like when we're entering transactions. And I'm going to use purchasing as an example. We'll go into a purchase invoice because it's most common type of transaction, that in general journal entries most commonly. And when I open the purchase invoice, I'm going to see the unposted purchase invoice list. And right off the bat here, you'll see that there's now what I called my dimension for company is called company code. And I can see the list of those entities of unposted transactions. This is already a filtered list that I'm only seeing transactions for those entities that I have access to. Here's where it gets really great in terms of creating those efficiencies when you're creating transactions as a user coming in to create a new transaction. At this point, you're going to determine which company does this transaction belong to. What is the owner of this transaction in terms of which company's set of financial records will this transaction reside? If you imagine sometimes where users are flipping back and forth between companies and they might think they're in the right company and they could quite easily post a transaction that's entered in the wrong company and they have to then figure out where it occurred, how to reverse it and get it set up again. This is you're making that choice real time right here. Which company does this transaction belong to? If I take a look at a transaction I've already got set up, and we say, for example, take a look at this transaction right here for company 400. Coming into the transaction window, all of the Business Central normal fields, everything looks exactly the same because it is exactly the same, just with MEM features added to it. And that feature starts here, up at the company code at the top of the transaction. Every single transaction, whether it's the purchase invoice or a sales invoice or a general journal, an inventory transaction, every transaction is going to have this company code up on the header to identify which set of financial books does this transaction belong to. If you'll notice here under the vendor name, we had those restrictions for vendors. This is now a filtered list. The user creating the transaction is not going to be able to post to a vendor that should not be applicable for this company 400. Down at the line level, this is where we're adding the company code again. Each individual line on a transaction could be allocated to another company if that was necessary for this transaction. And that's kind of the point of today's presentation, is to show you how intercompany transactions can be affected and managed easily and in sync across all the companies in a single transaction. On this line, I've got insurance charge for company 400, but I could just as easily add another line here and say, well, this particular invoice is actually applicable to more than one company. And based on the companies I have access to, I can select another one at the line level and say, okay, once again, this is for Now, a portion of this bill is allocated to company 100, and I'll add an additional charge. And this is where the MEM business logic comes into play. In standard Business Central doesn't know that this is an intercompany transaction and is not going to affect any due to or due from entries. But MEM business logic is going to automatically know that this is an intercompany transaction. And what we do is we automatically insert those due to and due from distributions on every transaction real time in this single transaction window. Now, when we come and take a look at the distribution, instead of it being a debit to the expense and a credit to the AP liability account, we're going to have additional distribution lines here. We can see under the GL entry preview that the first line is going to affect company 400's insurance. The second line is company 100 for insurance. And now these due to and due from, we have an AR due from company 100 and an AP liability due to company 400. These lines insert automatically. So there is a setup where you can configure what are the due to and due from accounts for every intercompany relationship and the transactions that may occur between them. And then we've got here, company 400 owns the transaction. They have the AP liability. It will be on their vendor subledger reports. But this happens real time. So automatically, all the companies included on a transaction are going to be in balance real time. This becomes really big at month end where there's no issue with reconciling due to and due from balances. It's always going to be in balance. You don't have that requirement to create an additional transaction entry and post it in another company. And maybe there's timing differences and your accounts are not in balance. It takes that extra time at month end to reconcile, which then increases the amount of time to close those periods and get those financial reports out to the appropriate individuals. Creating those intercompany transactions happens automatically. I could have as many lines as I need to on a single transaction, and that MEM business logic is automatically going to reconcile those due to and due froms between all of the related parties. So that's on this single transaction. I'm just going to delete this line and say we've also added the ability to streamline the process because you can be working with so many companies. We've added the ability to include an allocation template. And this is, for example, where you always have the same allocations. I could be on this purchase invoice for insurance where that bill comes once a year and it always gets allocated the same way, same percentages to the same companies. But maybe it's on a journal entry and it's month end and you have shared services or management fees that there's an allocation that gets done every month end. Instead of having to add those individual lines like we saw row by row manually, you can use an allocation template. And I can show you what that setup looks like, as many as you need. But this particular allocation template says every time I use this on a transaction, I'm going to allocate to these three companies based on these percentages. It automatically does those additional line entry for you, so you don't have to do it manually. And when I do that, by simply selecting that template, that's going to change my distribution. So instead of it being a 1 or 2 line distribution for those due to and due froms, I've got 10 lines here where I've got an allocation of 50% to my company 000. The associated due to and due froms come in. Then I've got company 200, another expense line, and the associated due to and due from. Company 100 had 30%, the associated due to and due from, and then my balance, that AP liability going to company 400. So if you think when I post this transaction, I'm actually updating 4 different companies' P&L, the balance sheet on 4 different companies, and the intercompany balances are in sync across all of these companies. This could get really expansive very quickly when you're working with a lot of companies and doing different allocations, and that template just is there to, again, streamline the process. How do we make it easier for users to enter the transactions across companies and be able to be in sync and have them reconciled real time? As mentioned, this is just a purchase invoice, but every transaction will look much the same. If we imagine the general journal and come in and take a look, it's going to be the same premise where you've got a company at the header, You've got individual company options at the line level. In this case, the example is a payroll transaction where a payment comes out of the bank account and we need to allocate those salaries across different companies. I've just shown it at the individual line level. And as you just saw on the purchase invoice, those due to and due from entries are going to come into play based on the entity at the line level versus what the entity ownership is at the header level. Another example I like to show is if we think about those are just general transactions, but oftentimes when it comes to an intercompany transaction, it comes up in the form of cash transfers or bank loans and investments in other companies. And how can we do that simply and easily when it's just a cash transfer? And I've got an example set here where we're transferring from one bank account to another bank account. I've done this on a single line saying the bank account owned by company 200 is transferring $10,000 to the bank account owned by company 000. And how that works is if we take a look at the bank accounts, and you can see this list, each bank account has a company ownership assigned to it. That way, whenever a transaction is using one of the bank accounts and it's say a transfer from account to account or utilizing a payment process, which we're going to take a look at in a moment, and it's a centralized payment process. MEM is looking at this ownership to determine when there's a due to or due from implication. So in this case, going from company 200 bank account to company 000, once again, is going to be an intercompany implication and automatically insert those distribution lines so that everything is in balance across all companies real time in that single transaction. There you see coming out of cash in 200, going into the bank account for company 000 and those associated due tos and due froms. That happens automatically. One thing that's often comes up as a secondary question is, well, what happens if I'm actually clearing those intercompany balances and I'm paying down from one company to another using that cash transfer? And how do we do that? We have the ability to do a clearing transaction where MEM recognizes it's a clearing transaction to reduce that intercompany implication or liability, and it will offset those entries to be able to clear that out. It's very simple to close out or clear those intercompany balances when payments are made across those companies. That's an example of intercompany just as an allocation at the transaction line. If you're doing intercompany trade, where it's actual transactions, a sales transaction or a purchase transaction between your companies, we've got our streamlined processes there where if you want to create a sales invoice to another one of your companies, we will automatically create that reciprocating purchase invoice in the destination company. It just saves on steps, and again, making it really streamlined and efficient to be able to transact between those multiple entities. And if it's in the reverse and you're actually creating a purchase transaction to go the other way to create a sales invoice, we also handle that side of it. The intercompany trade transactions become really simple where you don't have to create additional steps. It can all be handled in that single process and create the two records from the originating company through to the destination company. So for next steps, I'd like to show you now that we've entered some transactions, how those intercompany work, how can we centralize operations? And if we stay in the area of purchasing, we'll take a look at the payment journal. That's often an area where our customers want to be able to centralize operations and really streamline things. So we'll take a look at the payment journal, and we're going to see how you can create a payment batch, two different ways, for as many companies as you want to include in a single batch. And that's really where things get efficient. So if you imagine the payables manager has several different companies to issue payment runs for, or check runs for, or EFT wire transfers for, and they're having to do it on a batch by batch basis or a company by company basis. And you still can using MEM. You can do it on single batches or single companies, but you can also streamline this to add multiple companies inside of a single batch and handle this all in one single streamlined process. And how we do that is we'll take a look at a decentralized payment batch as the first option. In a decentralized payment batch, each company has their own bank account that they issue their payments out of. And we can still do that in a single batch. In this window, the suggest vendor payments is all the standard Business Central filter options, because we don't change any of that, but we've added in this company filter field where now you can determine which companies you want to include in this batch by simply selecting them here. I could include all of them. I'm going to, in this case, I'm going to do 3 different companies to say, okay. And once I do that and say, okay, Business Central is going out and pulling out all invoices that fall into those particular filters and populating them into this batch. The mem aspect is showing you this is a transaction for company 100 subledger, company 200 subledger, and so on. Even though if we scroll across and take a look, this vendor, Fabricam, is actually a shared vendor and has transactions in both of these companies. And if we scroll all the way over to the right, you'll see that the bank accounts listed are separate bank accounts. Even though there's separate bank accounts, separate companies, I can still run this in one single batch to really streamline this operational task. If you're issuing checks, they'll print on your separate batches. When it comes time to printing, that Business Central standard logic takes over and it's going to print a payment batch. But let's imagine if you were doing an EFT file transfer to the bank. It's going to create 2 separate files, because in this case, there are 2 different bank accounts. It'll create those 2 files automatically to go off to the bank. And in this case, I'm using 2 bank accounts, but if you can imagine that you have 10, 20, 30, we've got customers with upwards of 100 bank accounts. This really streamlines that process. That takes hours normally for them to do their payment batches, but in this case, we can do this all in a really simple process inside of one single batch. That's a decentralized process. I mentioned there's going to be 2 ways to do it. The second method, and just to make things easier, I've got a batch already set up, is what I would call a centralized payment process. That's where companies effect all of their payments out of one single bank account. Each company still has their own subledger of vendor transactions, but when it comes time to making the payments, they want everything to run out of their centralized bank. Maybe it's their head office generates all the payments for all of the different companies' vendor liabilities. And in that case, they're actually creating an intercompany transaction because there's a cash loan. If you notice again, this is company 100 subledger transaction. This is company 200 subledger transaction, company 300. Even though this vendor is shared, these transactions reside on each individual company's subledger. But if we come over here and take a look at the bank account, we're using one centralized bank account. This transaction of $18,890.60 is actually going to be an AP liability for intercompany between company 100 and company 000, which is the company that owns this bank account. Again, whether it's decentralized or centralized, however you're generating those payments, you can manage that for all of those companies inside of this single batch. That's, again, making that operational process so much easier. So the next thing we think about is, okay, well, we're grouping all of this data together. I've got all of my companies inside of one Business Central company. What happens when I want to do an inquiry or just do a quick check to look up a record or a transaction? Maybe I've got a customer inquiry or a vendor inquiry. How do I isolate that data and find things quickly and easily? And if we stay on the topic of the purchasing side of things and we go into the posted purchase invoices, this is everything that I have access to as a user for my permissions. I have access to 6 companies. That's all I'm going to see here. So a user is never going to inadvertently see data for a company that they shouldn't have access to. So whether it's like in this case, your posted purchase invoice lines, everything's going to be listed here. And just like you can at any other time, you can send this data out to Excel, where you can slice and dice the data any way that you need to. But you can also filter to say, well, let's get really specific to, an individual company And I can do that and filter down to company 100 transaction lines. I can go to a specific, in this case, inventory item. If I go and try and take a look at actual posted purchase invoices, which I thought I pulled up in the first place, it gets really easy if you have, for example, a vendor that calls up and says, I've got an invoice that hasn't been paid. That might be a vendor that gets shared. They don't necessarily know where company has been posted into. They said, well, it's just invoice number, let's say 107086. I just want to know what the status is. As a user, you don't have to log in and out of various companies to find where that invoice has been posted to. It comes up automatically. You can see at a glance, this is actually for company 400, and go in and take a look and see what the particulars are and how you can respond. Really easy to go through the inquiry process and really get to the specific transaction you're looking for when you may have multiple companies that you're searching through. The same thing is true when it comes to the reporting. And within the reporting, you've got the ability to see all of your data by individual company or in a consolidated view in a matter of a couple of steps. And so if we think, again, like we're talking about the vendor side of things, if I want to take a look at a vendor trial balance, I can run a consolidated report for any companies I want, or I can run a trial balance by entity. And we'll take a look at both of those, because this is where it gets really important at month end, or you're trying to make decisions on what your total spend is across your vendors. And maybe that gives you the ability to negotiate for group buying rates, or to ensure that all of your discounts, maybe their payment discounts, that those can be captured in real time. In this window for a consolidated report, I've got the company filter. Once again, I can say these are the individual companies that I want to include on this consolidated report. It may be individual, it could be all of them. And then I can also just pick by vendor or by vendor posting group or whatever other filter that's available to you straight out of the box, Business Central. And I'm going to put a date in here. Of course, you have the ability to send this to PDF, to Excel, to the scheduler, whatever you would like. In this case, we'll just preview this. When this comes up, I can see at the top, these are the filters I've put into place. I'm receiving information on these three entities. And now I've got a consolidated view. This is the total liability, the ending balance on September 30th across all of my companies. A lot of times we have cases where our customers were having to export data out to Excel on different sheets from each company and then be able to pull that together into a consolidated view. And it took a lot of steps. In this case, all I do is select the companies I want to include, put my date range in, and as simple as a few seconds, I've got a consolidated report that is affecting, in this case, 3 different companies. It really makes that data quick to access. As you can imagine, the power in being able to see this centralized view and get that overview of the company liability, the total spend, or maybe even just make decisions on how much you're spending with a vendor and how to improve on your buying rates and so on. That data is so quick to access. But at period end, that's another factor. And you might not always want to have that consolidated view. And when all you have is a consolidated view, it's really tough to be able to see that individual efficiency for your individual different companies. In this case, actually, I don't want a detailed one. That's going to be a little bit too big. Then vendor trial balance. We'll do just trial balance by entity. In this case, it could be period end, and you need your month-end working papers, and you want to have your individual company reports. I'll do those same options and put in the same date filters. And now when this comes up, instead of it being that consolidated view, this is now the trial balance for company 000. And the individual balances for those vendors. When I go to the next page, it's now a separate report for company 100, and then a separate report for company 300. And we include that grand total at the end just to give you that quick snapshot of the total. But now, if you're working with a lot of different companies, instead of having to run this one by one, it takes the same amount of time as it takes to run that consolidated report, which becomes really powerful in terms of time savings, giving you really that quicker time to decision, which is important, or giving the ability to perhaps streamline your process and reduce the amount of time it takes for your month end close and get that quicker time to the reporting and the data that you really need to be accessing. So this is at the subledger. All of the Business Central reports are MEM enabled. That means that they've got security attached to them. The user can only access a report for a company that they have been given permissions to. They'll never see data that is not relevant to their particular role. This also works in the case of an income statement and a balance sheet, that you can get that consolidated total, you can get that individual report by company. If we take a look at the trial balance, you might have cases where you want to have your trial balance, instead of it being a consolidated total or an individual report by company, perhaps you want to see it with different columns across the top. You can automatically send this to Excel if there's enough columns that they're not going to fit on a single page. Rather than taking the extra steps, you can just have it automatically open in Excel for you. So there you have it. I'll make this a little bit bigger, and you can see that I've got a column for each company. With this inside column is the total of those three balances. Of course, if I change this and I add more companies, that total is going to dynamically update. If we talk about financial reporting, you can get your income statement and your balance sheet, but MEM also works with the advanced reporting tools. If you need more advanced reporting and you're using a tool such as Solver or Power BI or maybe Jet Reports, MEM works perfectly well with all those. And as Justin had indicated earlier, really any extension or any other app that you're adding to Business Central, MEM is going to work with. We either have a direct link or they just doesn't need it and it works fine out of the box. I've got an example down here where I've just embedded a Power BI report right onto this desktop. And in this case, we've got a few reports that we've created. They're quite straightforward. This is just a MEM income statement, just to give you that visual of how easy it is to be able to add that to your desktop. You can set this up and configure it however you like. We've just made it really simple, and we've got the individual accounts listed here, but I can now toggle from company to company to get those different balances based on whatever date I want to show it as. If you can easily do that and add that to your desktop, or whether it's a solver that you're using or Jet Reports, as I mentioned. If you're using the financial reports in Business Central, that's fine too. I've got some examples set up here where if you're creating your own row format and your own column layout, I can set this up with the columns across the top. Instead of one consolidated total or individual reports, this view allows me to see companies as a column across the top. Now, in my row format, I've grouped my GL accounts by the type of revenue line I want to show. And in my column layout, if I show you what that looks like, I've just created headings for each column header. I've called it whatever I want. It can be entity one, company one, or whatever your company names are, of course. And in this field here, I'm just indicating which company dimension value is populating on this particular column. I've included a total at the bottom saying my formula for my total is just add up these various columns. And now I've got that view of my company balances across the top. If you're doing consolidations, again, that becomes really simple, and you're doing groups and you have perhaps your elimination company and you're grouping different subsidiaries together. That's also very simple. I just would create a different column layout. In this case, I've got what's called group one, group two, my elimination company, and my consolidated totals. And that looks like this, where I've said, on this particular column, I'm grouping companies 0, 1, and 2. My second group is companies 3, 4, and 5. My elimination company is dimension value 700. I'm posting all of my elimination entries there to come up with my consolidated total. Again, lots of options for that financial reporting to give you that ability to see your overall corporate performance, either consolidated or individually. Maybe sometimes it's just an ad hoc report for a particular company. You get that really simply when you're using MEM installed into Business Central. We also touched on where right now we're using one Business Central company. If you have scenarios where you want to separate and have different Business Central companies with different MEM companies inside, maybe it's because you've got 10 US companies and maybe 5 UK companies, you can do that. And we've got that module of MEM that allows you to do those intercompany transactions across BC companies now, really giving you that ability to work no matter how global your business is, or if you have different types of industry and you want to separate them a little bit, you can still do those transactions and make sure those intercompany balances are in sync in that real time. So that's kind of like a high level overview of what we plan to cover in MEM today. I hope that gives you a really good understanding of how efficient and streamlined this process can be.
I just want to say a huge thank you to you and Jerry. Once again, you guys did a great job.
Thanks,
Thank
Allie.
you very much.
And and I guess we'll see you next week for the subscription billing webinar, which we're hosting as well.
Yes, definitely. Thank you both so much. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Yeah, you too. Take care, guys. All the best.
Have a great day. Bye.
Bye.